Why did you go to Nicaragua this past summer?
So I went with to Nicaragua with a club called GlobeMed. We have been funding a domestic violence shelter for the past few years, and it was at its culmination. And so we were on the brink of finishing construction of the shelter, and so we went there to make sure that everything was going according to plan, that there were no problems, that sort of thing. So a lot of it was evaluation. And also, we work with a partner on the ground in Nicaragua, and so a lot of that was strengthening ties to that partner, making sure that we had a good basis of communication with them.
Okay. And how long were you there?
We were there for 3 weeks.
Okay. So who were you working with there? Because you mentioned a partner organization.
Yes, so we work with an organization called Salud Sin Límites, which means Health Without Limits. And so they've been based in the area since the mid-'80s, and they've more or less been working with child and maternal health. That's part of their mission statement. And so what we've been doing with them, more or less for the past 2 years, is working on the shelter, which does have to deal with maternal health in terms of women who are being abused in their families will come to the shelter with their children and have a safe place to stay.
So I guess, do you want to say more about like the project you did with the shelter and like why you chose to implement it? What your goals were with the project?
Certainly, yeah. So what's the reason why we chose the project in the first place was, well, most of it was talking to our community partner and saying, hey, we have this capacity to fundraise this year. We want to know what are some of the social issues that you've identified in your community, and how can we help deal with them. And so they basically gave us this set of statistics that said, okay, domestic violence is a huge problem here, and basically what's happened in Nicaragua is that the more built up part of the nation, which is on the Pacific side, they have tons and tons of shelters, tons of programs to help these women. Whereas on the more semi-autonomous side, on the Atlantic coast, there's no resources for the women who are being abused, and so we've actually built the only shelter that's within like a 13-hour drive of anywhere in that radius, and so that was part of the reason why we built the shelter in the first place. Nicaragua has the highest instance of domestic violence of any Central American country. It's affected about 60% of the women there, and then 1 out of 6 of every woman in Nicaragua is a victim of domestic violence. And so 60% of those cases actually come out of this area that we're working in. And so obviously, if it doesn't have the resources to deal with this problem, then that's obviously an issue.
Right. Okay. And so, did you run into any problems when you were trying to implement?
Absolutely, yes. So one of the biggest problems that we ran into was that we were sort of misled by the municipal government. We had entered into a budget contract with them a few months prior to coming to SIUNA, and what that meant was that we were bringing $20,000 to the table to build the shelter, and they were pledging $40,000. And so while we were there, what happened was we began talks with them, and what they more or less said was, okay, we'll give you this money, but we also want to co-own the shelter. And so if you don't know, the government in Nicaragua is communist for the most part, and so this party had just been voted in, and they were communist. And so one of our biggest fears was that if they did co-own the shelter, they could more or less take it over, take away our part of the ownership of the shelter. And so for that reason, we couldn't accept their money. And so they wouldn't really budge on that subject. And so by the end, we just said, okay, we're going to try to build this with the money that we have. And we have done basically all the renovations required to make the shelter livable, basically inhabitable for the women, for the children, and so we were really happy that was able to be done. But unfortunately, the shelter still needs a lot of renovations in terms of making it sustainable for the next few years.
Okay. So what did you do to try to solve this issue? Because like you get there and then like, oh well, we're not going to give you this money. So like, what did you guys do?
So we desperately tried to meet several times with the government in Siuna. This is the municipal government, not the national government. And so the mayor, who was more or less had just been voted in, she would often just skip meetings, tell us, okay, I'm busy at this time, I can't come, and so we eventually just sort of had to track her down and try to talk to her. And so we did talk to her for a little while, and she basically said, "I'm sorry, we can't budge on the subject." So that was a big problem with that for us. And so we talked with our partner later that night and basically said, okay, what are the logistics of, if we can't accept this money, what can we do to make this project go forward? And so we basically reviewed the budget with him, and we're able to sort of come to a consensus on what we could do, and what the timeline for making the shelter inhabitable would be, and we went with that.
Okay. Yeah. So what did you learn from this experience, and what would you have changed if you're doing this in the future? I mean, I know you're going this summer, but
yeah,
what would you change?
Well, I think part of it was we can't necessarily trust the government, the municipal government at least, in terms of making a budget. So basically, when we are planning our budget in the future, any money that they promise us really just needs to be left out of the budget completely, in order to make whatever project we have successful, whether or not they are playing in the project or not. So that was definitely something we learned. Also, we just sort of learned that politics in Siuna are a huge mess.
Yeah. Okay. And this is kind of going back to just like domestic violence in general in Nicaragua, but would you say that domestic violence kind of stems from larger issues such as like structural violence? And I know there's a big issue with machismo and like Marianismo.
Marianismo, yeah. So absolutely, I definitely think a lot of the problem that we're dealing with does stem from the structural violence, and just looking at the entire system that creates it can be kind of disheartening sometimes, in terms of what can we do to mitigate this, much less just change it completely. And so I think what we've done in terms of building the shelter is, even if these women, more or less the reason why we built the shelter was so that women who came to Siuna from the sort of surrounding area of the Campo would be able to stay someplace and be safe while they reported their case. And so what that basically allows is that these women can basically find a safe place for their family if they don't have family outside, or family that they can stay with. And so that's basically something that we say mitigates the structural violence, is that we may not be able to combat it directly in terms of, oh, the police are corrupt, they will not, they may not take this case seriously because it's a domestic violence case, or the national government is corrupt, where they've just passed a law that basically says any case can be mediated, in terms of the man may or may not go to jail, whether or not the woman says, okay, it's okay that you abuse me, let's move on. But a lot of times what will happen is the women will say that so that because they think that their husband is the primary provider for the family. And a lot of times that's actually not true. A lot of them are very dysfunctional. But aside from that, so that's a big thing, is there's a lot of what you said earlier, machismo, where the men really are allowed to do whatever they want. And basically there's a society where the police, who are, for the vast majority of them, they are almost all male, what will happen is if any case is brought to them by a woman or even by a man, a lot of the times they'll disregard it. And so by building this shelter, even if the case is not necessarily if it's reported and not really taken seriously, we sort of hope that by giving these women the time to sort of recuperate and allow themselves to sort of reflect on what they can do in terms of improving their lives and getting away from their abuser, we sort of hope that will mitigate the problem.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to talk about or say just about your experience in general? Do you have any like stories?
Oh, really?
Yeah. Do you have any stories about? Oh, okay. Can you tell the story about how you tried to get in touch with the mayor?
Oh yeah, sure. So for like the first week and a half that we were there, we kept we asked our partner, hey, can you give us the contact info for the mayor or set us a meeting for the mayor. And so like 2 or 3 different times we would go to the police station in the morning, which is like right next to where the mayor's office is, and we'd ask them, hey, is the mayor here? And they go inside, and it was pretty obvious they were talking to somebody, and they would come back out and say, oh, she's not here right now. And sometimes she literally wouldn't be there even if we had made an appointment with her. And so a lot of that I think came from the fact that first of all she was newly elected, and second of all she was more or less following what the system that had already been in place before her. A lot of that stemmed from political reasons. She wanted to strengthen her clout in terms of following what the national government was sort of putting forth in terms of guidelines. And so we understood why she was acting the way that she was, but at the same time, for us, in terms of defending your constituents' rights, it just made absolute no sense. Yeah. So I think it was basically the middle of the 3rd week that we were there. We were able to talk with her for 5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's all, really. Is there anything
Anything I would have done differently?
Yeah. Anything you would have done differently?
Probably not have gotten involved with government, or at least made sure that so we had already signed a budget with them, and they had not decided that they needed to own the shelter or at least co-own it. But